I'm Chris Jones-Jenkins, Reconstruction illustrator, mostly reconstructing castles, but various other things. And today I will be talking about one of the castle reconstructions that I've done, particularly complex one with very little physical evidence to go on, but one that we successfully completed to quite a high degree of, hopefully, accuracy, but certainly a high degree of completion. Can everybody hear me? Great. Okay, well, right, I've been told that I have to get through this very, very quickly. I take it, the light entertainment in the middle of all this historical stuff that you're all absorbing. But don't relax too much, because this is going to be quite a fast ride, hopefully. But before I start, we've already we've already heard about Rick Turner. This is very much Rick's project. He came to me with a challenge. Can we reconstruct a building that barely exists at all? And this is what we've done. So let's make a start. Okay, we've already been through the history once today. Edward I, conquest of North Wales. This is one of the baronial castles that we were talking about, that Andy was talking about. In this case, Dinas Bran on the left. That was the Welsh headquarters in this area. But the new Marcher Lord was not going to live on the top of a hill in the middle of nowhere. He actually moved from Llangollen down to the River Dee, a nice little spot on the banks of the river. So, if Rick were here, this is the history that he compiled of the castle. It would take the rest of the afternoon if we go through it, but we can limit this to 4 or 5 sections that are relevant to the reconstruction work. Clearly, the initial building of the castle, 1280s. About 100 years later, Richard II decided to move the treasury from Westminster to Holt. I slipped that in especially for Jeremy. Remember that we worked on this some years ago. That's the Jewel Tower in Westminster, which was transferred to Holt in the 1390s. About 100 years later, William Stanley acquired the castle. Didn't keep it very long. He was executed, which seems to be quite a theme today. Barons being executed for one reason or another. But when Henry VII took over, he carried out an inventory of the site. So everything that was of any value within Holt Castle was inventoried. The following years just document the decay of the castle. There are various inventories drawn up at that time. There were also plans which we'll come to later. And eventually, the castle was dismantled completely, and all the stone taken to Eden Hall, which is a little bit further upriver, where a new house was built. And then we come to the Buck Brothers illustration in 1742, which is usually the starting point, really, when you're doing a reconstruction. But in this case, by the time they got there was hardly anything left. Although you have seen, in the very first slide, you've seen how much survives now, which indicates really that the destruction didn't stop with the construction of Eaton Hall, but it continued to be quarried. And there's considerably less surviving now than there was when the Bucks were there. So, what Philip was saying about how we go about doing reconstructions, we will have very little normal reconstruction work here. Clearly, we would look at what survives in the area and what was going on at the time, which is illustrated here by Conway Castle. We've heard about the Edwardian castles that were being built at the time. Lewis is a castle that was built by John de Warenne, who was the baron who built Holt. We looked at things that Richard II built, to see whether we could see any evidence of what he got up to. And we looked at symmetrical castles, which was a passion of Rick's, and which he thought would contribute greatly to the reconstruction of Holt, but it actually didn't work out that way. But it did afford us an indication of just how you put rectangular rooms into strange shaped buildings, which became very useful. So, let me get that out of the way. Okay, the inventories. The inventory that Henry VII had carried out is the red band here. And I think, although you're obviously not going to be able to read that, you can see that the red band is by far the greatest colour on this chart. And it covers virtually the whole castle. What it's telling us, in fact, is that we have 5 towers, T1 to T5, and in between each of those towers there's a range. The towers are, one of them is 3 stories, one of them is 5 stories, 3 of them are 4 stories. Each of the ranges in between are, generally speaking, 3 stories. Little bits to tweak in between there, but generally speaking, 3-story ranges and tall towers. That information was put into a chart like this by Lol Butler in, I think, the 80s. Rick elaborated on it. The colouring that we have here are suites of rooms that Rick thought required communication between them, and communication from one colour to another colour was, generally speaking, not required. It may happen, but it may not happen. Some of them, for instance, the nursery, for instance, had to be kept isolated. So what we're doing here is trying to work out the communication patterns within the castle. The other thing that Rick worked out from the inventory was that the surveyors did not randomly pick rooms. They didn't say this tower contains so-and-so, that range contains so-and-so. They walked around the castle in a single journey. And that also defines the availability of passageways between various rooms. So it's all getting quite complicated at this point, but that's because we're doing it in 2 dimensions. Right, there were also other documents available to us. A plan, this plan, 1562 plan by Randall Holmes, which is accompanied by a drawing, which is particularly useful if you're doing a reconstruction. So that was quite useful. We had another plan. This particular plan was actually discovered during the project. It was found by a member of the Holt Local History Society. He recognised it for what it was. But unfortunately, this one does not have an elevation or drawing to go with it. And then, of course, there is this plan, John Norton's plan from 1620, which, again, of course, has the view to go with it. and this view is very, very well known, and it's used all the time as a post-medieval, medieval illustration of a castle. It's a beautiful drawing. It's actually been adapted as the logo for Holt Castle. So, but there we go. This is what actually survives on site. There's another view of it. When it was covered in undergrowth, it was quite easy to misunderstand it. It appears to be a castle, a tower sitting on a rock, whereas in fact it's quite the opposite. It's a courtyard sitting on a rock, and the castle that surrounded it has disappeared completely. Each face was surveyed and drawn for us, and there are 5 faces. The short one in the middle is this face here, and the only reason it's shorter than the others is because half of it was still covered when they were doing the survey. However, the missing bit we did eventually do something with. This is the covering that's on it. That pink concrete it is, in effect, is an attempt to stabilise the rock. Back in the 60s, I think it was, and they're afraid to take it down now in case the whole thing collapses. But it's quite unsightly. You will see that on occasions. But on top of that, I found three stones. 3 stones in a line, of course, mean a wall. And luckily, there is a wall beneath it. And the wall, in fact, eventually was completely uncovered. But this was not done for architectural purposes. So if you can see these 2 stones here match up with these 2, the 3 stones I identified in the beginning, and indeed the next course down, have been removed. And that's because this was not done for archaeological purposes. It was done in order to build a new staircase to get the public up onto the top of the courtyard. Nevertheless, it was quite useful to have it because it completed that face that we were missing earlier. Right, this particular face is just one of the 5, but it is one that I will return to occasionally through this talk, simply because it has recognisable features, easily recognisable features, and hopefully you will not get too lost as we wander around. First off, of course, is the door. Once upon a time, when this may have been a tower on a rock, that would have been the way into the castle. In fact, it's a staircase coming down from the courtyard and entering a room that has subsequently disappeared. In the top of this wall, you can see there are some holes, notches. They carried ceiling beams, which tells us that this is in fact the inner wall of a room that's disappeared. And on this end, there's a hole in an area of rough stonework. That hole, we don't know where it goes. We can get in there about 2 feet before we reach the bats. And because it's a bat roost, we couldn't explore any further. So that hole survives, but we don't know where it goes. The bit that doesn't survive, we can speculate where that is going, and I'll do that later. But for the moment, what confused us here mostly was that the fact that we had beams for the ceiling, but we had no beams for the floor, until we realized that this room was sitting on a much bigger block of rock than you see now, and it's all been quarried away to the point where they stopped at those walls. And had they not stopped at that point, none of this would have been possible. Right, in addition to those surveys, the land around was surveyed, and the block on in the centre was also surveyed, and you can just about make out the surviving walls on the top of that block. But I surveyed them myself and plotted them and started to model that piece of surviving wall. So this is the initial model. Just about two of the 5 sides survive with quite a lot of features in them. This is the face that we were talking about earlier. There's the doorway, the staircase up to the courtyard level, the hole in the wall here. But you can probably see, hopefully, that the floor levels on each face are not at the same level. They go up and down. That particular one is much higher than this one, and they vary all the way around the castle. So, the 3 plans that we have. 2 of them are quite similar, and one of them is very different. Bear in mind that we're looking for 5 towers with a range in between. The similarities in these 2 were really too close to dismiss, whereas this one has that square tower directly opposite the gate. This is the symmetry that Rick was looking for, but it was dismissed at this point because of the information on the other 2 were similar enough that we could work with 2 rather than use the 3rd one. So we stuck with these 2 plans, which look similar until you actually compare them, superimpose them on top of each other, and they are significantly different. But now that I've modelled the courtyard, we can scale them up to fit the courtyard. And the 1610 plan is quite a good fit. It has the wall thicknesses are correct, as you can see. The spiral staircases in the corners fit, although there are 5 of them and only 3 on the other plan, but we can come to that later. But that was quite a good fit. This plan is not such a good fit. If you look at the thickness of the walls here, they're about a quarter of what they ought to be. So therefore we should really be dismissing this one. However, there's a lot more detail in that plan than there is in the 1610 plan. So what we decided to do was to accept the dimensions in the 1610 plan, but use the details that were included in the 1562 plan. So from that, I can start modelling the outer ranges. And once we started modelling the outer ranges to this scale, we found that they were in fact correct to the dimensions that were given in some of the inventories. The diameters of the towers were correct, the width of the ranges were correct as well. So, we hang on to this for its detail only. And you can see from parts of this, and in fact from the text that goes with it, some of the walls are dotted. The text actually says that the roof of the kitchen is lying on the floor of the kitchen. It's in a state, and this is the earliest of the plans. So the later plans, the castle is in a much worse state, which perhaps explains why they're not quite as accurate as we would like them to be. But here we go. I've modelled now the plan at the courtyard level, which is the top of the surviving rock. We've got the diameters of the towers correct, but we need to look at the diameters of the towers on the ground, which is like 20 feet below where I'm working at the moment. And in order to do that, of course, excavations. The Welsh Museum organised excavations to try and locate the bases of the towers. Found lots of bedrock, some of it looking suspiciously like a tower, some of it more convincingly dressed, although quite why it was dressed in that way we didn't know until eventually we found this at the base of the kitchen tower, dressed bedrock and masonry built against it, facing on the rock. And those are the locations where the excavators thought the towers were. This particular one is the kitchen tower, the one I showed you that survived quite well. And when I superimpose my plan onto it, the kitchen tower fits quite neatly. The exchequer gate, which is the tower in front of the entrance, fitted. And from that, we could take it from the diameter when it hits the ground up to the diameter of the top of the top of the courtyard. We can get the batter of the towers and the batter that in fact goes all the way around the castle. I say there the chequer tower is off centre to the inner gate, which you can probably make out from that. That was a little worry, but well, I'll explain that later. But we now have the batter that goes all the way around. So we're roughly at this stage now. And before we go up any further, I think I'll just summarise what happened when the walls were taken down. That's the hole in the wall. Once all the walls were taken down and the masonry was taken away, the facing on the outside of the castle would have been removed, but they still continued quarrying and taking the bedrock away from it until it was just that left. So, right, that's enough about demolishing it. Let's take it up. We start rebuilding it. We know that the towers, 5 towers we're looking for 2 of them. One of them with 5 stories, one with 3 stories, 3 with 4 stories. So let's look at the drawings that we have. And we'll do this one first, as it's the most famous one. Okay, how many stories have we got in those towers? At best 2. The ranges we worked out were 3 stories. One story on that drawing. We dismissed the plan that went with this quite easily earlier on. This is going the same way, really. But for the Exchequer Tower, this tower in the front, we could have thrown it away, but we thought, well, let's hang on a little bit, because that is slightly better than that one. That little doll's house clearly is not what the excavators have found in the ground. But the rest of it, all those towers have the right numbers of floors. The range, the one range we can see, has the right numbers of floors. That's looking quite good. And we also have this rectangular attachment here with slightly different windows, rather more ornate windows than the rest of the tower. And we decided that that is Richard II's treasury tower. That was what he did in order to move the treasure from Westminster to Holt. So we accept this view. This is what we want our castle to look like, with the exception of the Exchequer Tower, which we'll borrow from the other. So that is what we ended up with. And that, of course, is the... can I just go back a second, because I want to point out one little thing. This little path running up here and entering the castle at that point, we hardly noticed it at the time. We didn't know what it was for, and probably didn't care. But nevertheless, it's there in the reconstruction, and it will become a bit more important later on. So this is the view that we have, and we've gone from that to that to that, and that's pretty simple, isn't it? But inside there is the three-dimensional jigsaw of the chambers and the communication. Somebody asked me how long these things take. That probably took as long as an entire reconstruction drawing in any other format. Just fitting these rooms together in a jigsaw was the best part of a year, I think. We can go back up slowly, pick up a few little points. All right, this ramp and the odd door going in there, that fitted into where the stables were in the inventories. And the stable could not be accessed from the courtyard, which was very, very odd. And we thought, oh, we've made a mistake. But the drawing shows the ramp going up into that room, and that must be because that is how they accessed the stables. Very strange. This room is the room I keep coming back to. Just to give you your bearings, there's the doorway with the staircase going up. That line running through the centre of that wall is the continuation of the hole in the wall. So we know it's coming out and it's within the thickness of that wall. And if you remember what I was saying about floor levels going up considerably at that point, if we go up another step, you can see the difference in the floor levels, and the hole has disappeared now. If we think of where that line might be going, if it were for the bats, we thought at first it was probably heading for a well or something in the courtyard, but there is absolutely no sign of anything in the courtyard. But that line is heading for this building here. And the inventory tells us that that's the kitchen. So it's probably a drain from the kitchen that runs the full length of the castle and out the opposite side. And why it's doing that is another thing that hopefully we'll come to if I have time. But if we continue up, we're virtually courtyard level now. This is where the bits that survive. But I can keep going up slowly. I mean, I could talk about all these little rooms, but we won't have time. But it is worth pointing out at this point that this room, the kitchen, if you remember, is the full height of the 3 floors in the range. And we know that because the plan says that the roof is on the floor. If there had been other floors in between, they would have caught it. So the roof has fallen into the floor. Also, because that occupies all 3 floors in the ranges, it ruins communication. It makes it very difficult to get from this range to that range, and that is why we have staircases in those corners. Because you now, if you want to get from this range in the front, you have to go down the staircase, across the courtyard, back up the other side, but you can't get through. That staircase is there for a similar reason, not because you can't get through, but because that's the Lord's chamber, and there's a lot more privacy involved there. And again, we'll come to that again later, if I get time. But we can continue on up. The route in the inventory suggested that the surveyors crossed the leads in 2 places, and I've marked those 2 places by these staircases. Probably no need for the staircases, they probably would have just walked over the roof, but they are there to complete the circuit that the surveyors were making. So, there we go, all the way up to the top. And we can do that, we did that on a plan, we can do it in section. Into the Exchequer Gate. If you remember, the Exchequer Gate was off-centre from the rest of the castle. And I've accommodated that by using the extra room on this side for 5 places and a staircase. And I should have pointed out to you, but I didn't, but the northern drawing of the Exchequer Gate suggests these buttresses on that side, which again pushes the centre line out. And there's the staircases and the fireplaces, and there you can see how the centre line continues through, although the Exchequer Gate extends further that way. Continuing on through, there's the staircase right to the drawbridge, and the drawbridge pit is here, but beyond the drawbridge pit there's a chamber underneath the main access. And again, that is not something that we've come across before in any castles, as far as we can make out, certainly not in medieval castle. And I thought, again, this must be a mistake. We've done something wrong, but we tried rearranging things, but we couldn't get it any other way. We have to have that chamber underneath the passage. And when we get to it, I will show you that we were actually correct in that assumption. So, driving on in, there are the 2 towers in the front, both 4-storey towers. you'll see that some of the chambers have fireplaces in them, some of them don't. We took the assumption that when a room was called a chamber, we took the assumption that that chamber had a fireplace in it. Basements didn't have fireplaces, storerooms didn't have fireplaces, but if it was described as a chamber, we put a fireplace in. And that gave us a nice number of chimneys to populate the roofscape, which is always good for reconstruction. Right, pushing on further, the positions of the spiral staircases in each tower, they came from the early plan, the one that we're using for details, and they worked out quite well in that location. In the middle there you can see the drawbridge pit, and if we go a little bit further in, you can see the chamber behind the drawbridge pit there. What you can also see here are the toilets, garderobes, and yes, the inventories make absolutely no mention of any garderobes. The inventory essentially is telling the king what goodies he has in the castle, what rooms those goodies are in, how he can get to them. He's not interested in toilets at all. And unlike modern surveyors and who seem to revel in the number of toilets you've got, we did purposely totally overpopulate this with garderobes because we could, really. But the garderobe itself, all the garderobes that we use, they're all based on Conway, and they are all serviced by the spiral staircase. There are no toilets coming from any of the chambers or any of the towers, as indeed they are in Conway, apart from this area here, which is the king's chamber, and he has his private toilet. And, well, we'll get to it later, but we have one here too. Right, there's a reconstruction I did for Conway in a minute, just showing how the toilets are accessed by the spiral stair. You can see from this the way I've staggered them so that we don't have hundreds and hundreds of shafts. They all exit via the same shaft and out, hopefully. Right, where are we? Okay, further in, we have arrived at the well. We know the well is there, again from the early plan, from the details of the plan. And we're beginning to see the kitchen taking up the entire range on that side. And if we drive a little further in, we can see much more of the kitchen there, as opposed to 3 stories in this range. This is quite an interesting point, because now we've arrived at something that we could see, something that survives. So all that cutting I've been doing has been through imaginary reconstruction. And we're here. And this chamber here is this. Okay, and you go through that doorway, down a couple of steps, and you're into another chamber here, which is the chamber beneath the access tunnel. So it is there. It's not a mistake. It survives. And we go through again into this chamber, which is the one that was excavated here. And if you remember, we've only just cut through the well in that location. So there's a well here, but this wasn't an archaeological excavation. We didn't find the well. Probably will never find the well unless the staircase falls into it, because this is where they're putting the staircase. Okay, so we can push on through. We can push all the way through if we want to, but we really need to move on. So, right now, I did say that there was one location where we didn't have the guardrails in the towers. That's this location here. Where we are is the hall here, going into the Lord's Chamber, and we know from the inventory that the Lord's Chamber gives the only access to the Treasury Tower here. So there's no other way into the Treasury Tower other than through the Lord's Chamber. And that's the extra staircase that's been inserted in order to bypass the Lord's Chamber if you're going working in this range. That tunnel, if you like, has a couple of guardropes in it. And as we go down through, you can see there's one there. And we push on through, you can see the plan had that strange hole in it. And that hole is this hole, and it's the shaft from the guardrope that I've placed in there. And if we push on down further, we come to this room, if you remember, the hole and the shaft. Well, it's not a shaft, as this tunnel that's running through that wall is directly underneath the shaft that we located on the plan. It's just 2 dimensions. If you're working in 2 dimensions, you would never know that these 2 things linked. Once you put it together, it makes perfect sense. The kitchen is flushing water out through the entire length of the castle in order to catch the base of that guardrape and flush it away. Okay, we'll just continue on a little bit further because you can see this little staircase appearing, which winds down and eventually emerges here at the water gate, and that is represented on the plan by this. Not quite as I had to build it, but nevertheless that's probably how the surveyor saw it at the time. It would be difficult to survey, and nevertheless it's a historical thing that we need access down into Bottrell's Pit, which is what the Watergate is called. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that as well. Right, so if you can remember that, we can see it all again in the video, if the video works. Right, what we did at this point, Rick and I, we gave our model to an animator and asked him to animate it for us. Now he's a bit of a gamer. It's very much that sort of, you know, there were some things we couldn't talk him out of. Like playing with the portcullises, for instance. You'll see those popping up and down all the time. But nevertheless, we go through the Exchequer Gate, we go into the courtyard, turn right, go down into the kitchen, And the kitchen, of course, is the full height of the range, so we pan up. And then out of the kitchen, across the courtyard, up the straight staircase into the hall. If you think it's flickering, that's because you're walking around with a flaming torch in your hand. Right, far into the hall, descend through that small door into the Lord's chamber. Far end of the Lord's chamber, we have that passageway with the toilets off it, but we don't go into the toilets, we just go down the passageway into the treasury. Okay, and that's the only way into the treasury. Right, now that was in this tower. We'll now proceed and enter the Watergate, which was Richard's addition in order to access it for the treasury, into Potter's Pit, up that long winding staircase that I showed you earlier, which is where the flaming torch is really needed. And you eventually emerge into this storeroom, which hopefully by now will be familiar to you. Okay. Now I've got to get out of it now.
Now, just click your arrow.
Arrow?
Left, yeah.
So, at this point, we said, right, that's it. The challenge was met. We'd reconstructed the castle. You will have noticed there was no furniture. It was unpopulated. It was all empty and dead, effectively. But that was as far as we were willing to go at that stage. However, John Goodall in Country Life, we asked him if he wanted to do an article on it, and he said yes, but having worked with John before, I know he doesn't like computer graphics, so he said, let's do a real drawing. So this is what we did, or what I did for him. And we tried to highlight bits and pieces that we hadn't shown in the video. And it in fact includes much of the inventory items, as well as the rooms. We'd already used the rooms, but we hadn't used the items that were in those rooms. So I've populated it with things that were actually mentioned in the inventory, like the stocks, things like a bed in the guard chamber, which was strange, but when you think about it, necessary, since these guys are going to be, once these drawbridges come up and the portcullises come down, those people could be in there for some time, so they need a bed. Various bits and pieces, storerooms, the hall. What we hadn't done, what we hadn't done for the model was the chapel tower, which is this room here, and the hangings for the chapel tower are all mentioned in the inventory. And in fact, the hangings in the hall are also mentioned, and it was the dimensions of the hangings that dictated how many windows we had and what spaces we had between the windows, so that all the hangings could be used. So all these things were important and hadn't been used before. So that was done for Country Life after the rest of the project was finished, and he's published it. So basically that's where we are, or where we were. We've gone from this image, this famous, beautiful image, nevertheless, perhaps not the most accurate illustrations of Holt, but a very nice picture. to this, which is the same view with our new model, which we hope is rather more convincing than the old, but the town council don't think so. They haven't changed. So, right, thank you. I hope I didn't rush through it too much. I hope you managed to follow it, but how did I do with time, Philip?
Spot on.
Oh,
Yeah.
Just a question about the stabling, which seems strange to me. You didn't mention
Yes.
an awful lot about it, other than it was there.
Yes.
Was it within the bowels of the walls?
yes, what I didn't mention and what we haven't done, the northern plan, the one that goes with the illustration on the left, does indicate that there is a very, very big outer bailey. So what appears to be inside the moat and vulnerable is not as vulnerable as it appears in this model, because we didn't model the entire bailey. Norton just indicates that it's there. There is absolutely nothing to work on to recreate it. So that's the assumption that we make, that it's not quite as vulnerable as it appears.
This is more a comment to link it back to Pamela's paper this morning. There's a indenture from 1318 when Sir John Milburn was appointed as constable, and he was paid to employ a janitor and a gatekeeper. And so Milburn himself was fighting in the Scottish Marches at the time. So you've got all of that castle, and certainly in 1318-19, there'd be 2 people living in it. Which is,
Yeah.
Pamela?
Thank you, Chris. That was a real tour de force. My question is, 3 stories seems excessive for a kitchen. Have you got any idea why it's so tall?
No, we don't. It's one of those things that as we were working our way through it, we just assumed we'd made a mistake. But there's no way around it. And as we say, if there were another floor in there, we wouldn't need 2 of those spiral stairs in the courtyard in order to avoid the thing. So no, it's there as far as we can make out. And again, the fact that it says that the roof of the kitchen is on the floor suggests that there was nothing to interrupt the falling of that roof.
Okay, and any more questions? We've got time for one more. There's one more question.